This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by ClimeCo to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Kaitlyn Allen and Amanda Shea of ClimeCo for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and a co-host, and I will be collaborating with Kaitlyn and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that's not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I am back with Erica Lasdon. Erica is a returning guest. I think you might actually be our first returning guest. Maybe Carol Liffman was the other. But we're really happy to have you back on. Erica is the Senior Director for our Capital Markets practice at ClimeCo and has extensive experience engaging with companies on ESG matters, including through proxy mechanisms and other means. Erica, welcome back to ESG Decoded.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. I'm honored to be a return guest.
And today we wanted to take some time. We're about halfway through 2022 proxy season, and we thought it would be a good time to check in and see what sort of trends that we're seeing in this year's season. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with public markets, I thought we might just start with a primer on what proxy season is and what it means. So if you could just start us off there, Erica, we'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. This is a really timely topic. If you pay attention to the news headlines, you're probably seeing headlines come in on a regular basis now, because where we are in the calendar right now is the sort of 2 to 3 month period where most of the annual general meetings happen for companies in the United States. And this is really a feature. You can think of it as sort of corporate election time. Companies put their boards of directors up for election during this time. There are also sort of standard resolutions that companies have to put on their proxy statements. So that's how shareholders vote. And in fact, some people may have even gotten these types of proxy solicitations. They can happen for a variety of reasons, but these annual meetings are really a time that the sort of corporate direction and the investors in general, shareholders, have a chance to say, yes, I want these corporate directors reelected, and they get a chance to vote on resolutions that the company can put forth or that shareholders can put forth. Shareholders can put forth a resolution if they follow some very specific rules. First of all, they have to meet a threshold for holding shares for an amount of time, and they have to have a de minimis amount. It's not that much. Others are SEC rules, including essentially that it can't be ordinary business that impinges upon the management's right to conduct the company's business. Over the years, over the last, I'd say 15 years, shareholders, particularly ESG-focused investors, have used this mechanism as a way to raise material ESG issues to be put on the proxy. And they're advisory votes. So that's the other key thing to know about these, is they're not binding. So an advisory vote means that it's public. So the company certainly has an interest, one, in not having not even having a resolution come onto the proxy statement. So what happens behind these resolutions is usually a fair amount of negotiation. But ultimately, if the filer and the company don't come to a withdrawal agreement, it will end up on the proxy statement. And even if it gets, I'd say, 15 to 20% of the vote, it really catches a fair amount of company attention. And these resolutions can be filed year after year. So usually once you have gotten a resolution on a certain issue, unless it garners an extremely low vote, it is a signal to a company that it's something that you probably can't ignore and you can expect to hear more from shareholders.
Oh, that's an awesome overview, Eric. So, Erica, tell us a little bit about what types of groups file resolutions.
That's a great question. So, As You Sow is an influential group that files a number of resolutions. I would say ESG investors in general as a group have led the pack and continue to lead the pack in terms of filing resolutions on environmental and social issues. Governance issues are, I'd say, the dominant focus of proxy season. They always have been, and even as environmental and social resolutions have become more common, it's important to note that governance resolutions, which might have to do with sort of the classic governance topics, the proxy season is a natural time for those things to come into play. So that would be executive compensation packages. Those always have to get covered during proxy season. And then other pieces of corporate governance. They can be relatively dry, but they're also very important aspects. So what are the rules that govern how the corporation is structured and shareholder rights are structured? So if you're really looking at the broad spread of issues, there are always a lot of corporate governance issues that are a part of proxy season. And I would say the investors that focus on environmental and social issues would include a number of ESG-focused investment firms. Religious investors have played, I'd say, a leading role there. And so there is a coordinating body called the Investor Center for Corporate Responsibility, and they have led a number of sort of faith-based investors and continue to file a lot of resolutions. A number of some of the more boutique ESG investment firms, Calvert Research and Management, I had previously worked there, Trillium, any number of asset managers are really active in terms of filing these types of resolutions. And then also the other large group of them are some of the institutional investors, pension funds. So California has two very active pension funds, New York City, and others are active on filing resolutions on climate, on diversity, on human rights, on any number of different types of environmental and social issues.
Thank you for giving that kind of overview. It's really helpful to kind of get the picture of what this looks like. There was one other clarification thing that folks have asked me about, and I thought this is a good place to ask it. When we say proxy season, when is the season? Why is it just a season? And are there any sort of rules that go along with the season?
Traditionally in the United States, proxy season happens from around April through June. And part of the reason that it happens then is the annual meetings tend to happen once the yearly financial statements are complete. So it takes a bit of time. Anybody who is in sort of corporate finance knows this. As the years end on the financial year, there is a lot of effort that goes into getting the annual report prepared. And that is the reason that the proxy season happens around that time. It's all about preparing for the financial statements for the annual meeting and for shareholders to see. So, that is a sort of a natural part of the rhythm in the United States. In other countries, it can be a little different. Japan, for example, has most of their proxy season in June. So it's not the same globally, but a lot of activity happens here during that time.
Okay, cool. All right. So now that we've got the basics, what is happening in 2022? So just for reference, we're recording this on May 27th, 2022. So why don't you give us a little bit of a flavor of what we've seen this season and the current topics? And then after that, we can dive into the most interesting part, which is sort of the trends behind the topics.
Yes. Well, first I will start by setting a little bit of a stage. Looking backwards over the last 5 years, there is a record proportion of proposals that have received significant support at shareholder meetings. And I'm just looking at the environmental and social side. So in 2015, it was at 13%, and by 2018, it was at 36%. It'll be really interesting to see where it ends up this year. That aggregate number only tells you so much, but I wanted to give a sense on how quickly there has been a lot of attention focused on this, shareholder attention overall. And with that, I would say there is a broader part of the reason there's that level of support rising is there's a broader awareness on the part of investors. The large investment shops, I think people who pay attention to ESG in investing will start by reading Larry Fink's annual letter to shareholders at BlackRock. Well, that's indicative of what's going on at places like BlackRock, State Street, and other investor shops that control a huge amount of the shares. They have increasingly changed their proxy voting guidelines to vote more actively in favor of environmental and social proposals, which is in line with their implementation, environmental and social analysis in their investment process. So as they've conducted and integrated these factors, recognizing their materiality, they have both voted in favor of more resolutions. They don't do this, no investor is doing this, I'd say, as sort of a tick the box exercise. They look at each resolution and they're analyzing each one of these companies. And when they see that they would support action that is called for in these resolutions, they will support it. So they vote for some and against others. But overall, that means that the vote totals have gone up. And that just shows you the rising tide of taking ESG into account. And I think it also indicates that there's more nuanced interest in ESG. So year over year, the topics I'd say that are at the forefront of resolutions have shifted a little, but stayed a bit the same. So climate change and environmental issues, are a evergreen topic if you look at the last 10 years. But, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the asks in the shareholder resolutions were a bit more basic. They were conduct a report on climate change risks or conduct a greenhouse gas assessment. And these days, it's more about not conducting an assessment, but setting targets, doing more full disclosure of scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, for those who have perhaps not dove into greenhouse gas emissions, scopes 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions are emissions that a company would more likely have under their direct control. So they would be from facilities that they operate. Think a factory or an office building through purchased electricity. And the scope 3 emissions are more indirect. They're part of supply chains or part of the end use of your product. And as I think the awareness of urgency for climate action gets more significant, the depth of investor interest in what the climate risks that a company faces and the steps that are being taken to mitigate those risks. And also, let's not forget the opportunity side to understand whether companies are aligned with strategic opportunities that may be in place from climate are really showing up in proxy season as well. So we've seen some resolutions that are sort of say on climate vote, in which a company sort of puts forth a climate transition plan, and it is a more fully developed type of plan than we would have seen 5, 6, 7 years ago. And the shareholders have an opportunity to vote on that plan, mimicked on executive pay plans that, are sort of a staple of proxy resolutions this time. So that's a little bit of a highlight of, I think, what is one of the big issues on everybody's mind for proxy season. But other issues also come into play. So diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, I think, are a big focus. And human rights, biodiversity, and other environmental issues, I'd say in the wake of COVID, sick leave and health issues are a bigger issue than they have been in the past. So you see a full range of issues.
I just want to point out something that you said, which was, the reason investors are doing this sort of thing, unless, say, it's a religious investor and it's more a values-driven type thing. The reason mainstream investors are participating in the, say, call it ESG movement is really that analysis. And I think that's what gets missed in a lot of these, frankly, insane headlines that you see about ESG that have nothing to do with reality. Companies and capital markets in general are recognizing that there are things not on the balance sheet that can materially impact the financial performance of a company. And that is what ESG means, right? It means incorporating environmental, social, governance factors into an investment decision. That's all it means. And unfortunately, a lot of people, especially this week, there's been a lot of headlines, folks that have no idea what ESG is, talking about it as if it's some sort of conspiracy. But, so I just wanted to point that out. You pointed the words that you use, it's based on analysis, right? And so these investment firms are very sophisticated. They're looking at the macro trends. They're understanding that climate risk can pose material risks to the companies in their portfolio, as one example. And they're asking companies to recognize that and make sure that they are taking action. And like you said, Erica, being able to position themselves for opportunities. So anyways, that's just my little sigh of the week.
That's a
I
great
wanted to point that out. I mean, there's a lot of sex this week.
Highlighted that.
Yeah.
And I want to underline that. I talked a lot about climate change already. And, that certainly poses significant material risks. It is, a significant issue for companies in almost every industry, but also the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that are on the radar screen for many companies are critical to talent retention and recruitment. And, all of these resolutions are being raised because they are considered to be material. And I will say that this is a little bit of insider information. The religious investors that I mentioned, lest anybody think that this is just driving a focus to say, don't focus on alcohol or some type of religious driven issue. The religious investors certainly may be motivated by their convictions, but also are extremely knowledgeable about, these are really specialized investors who have deep knowledge as well and are not going as some sort of protest, but are really focused and do the same type of nuanced investing. So I wanted to provide a little bit of clarity there because I didn't get a chance to explain it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm much less familiar with those types of groups than I am with the, say, more mainstream investors, I guess. So thank you for making that clarification. Okay, so you've outlined broadly several of the, say, hot topic issues that we're seeing a lot more of. So let's talk about the trends behind that. So you mentioned this a little bit, alluded to it earlier when you said, they used to be, please just do a climate risk report, or please do your greenhouse gas baseline as an example. And now we're seeing more, they're saying, hey, please set a greenhouse gas reduction target, or please disclose your scope 3 emissions. Let's talk a little bit about that, how the different topics have evolved, and what do you think that means?
I think we're really at an interesting convergence point. And convergence is a word that I think people throw around a lot. The reason I use it here is because I think that there are a number of things that have accelerated quickly over the last year relating to ESG that are important to keep in mind. For one thing, things naturally build upon, earlier work is the building block for the things that we see now. So when a company has done a greenhouse gas inventory, it's natural to say, what are the trends that you see from that greenhouse gas inventory? We all know that greenhouse gases are rising. What do you do to bring those down? And particularly as the external measures of what is needed in order to, meet the global challenges, in order to, to meet the targets that scientists are telling us we need to meet. The window is getting narrower and narrower. So to address that question through a climate lens, I would say that investors are currently looking to see companies disclose fully their climate change risks in line with leading frameworks like the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They're also looking for decarbonization plans, and they're interested in milestones that are detailed, science-based, Paris-aligned, and increasingly certified by reputable organizations such as the Science Based Target Initiative. They're also looking increasingly at how it affects other aspects of corporate activities. So corporate lobbying practices, political spending, alignment of CapEx, all of those pieces are part of what investors are looking at. They're really taking a comprehensive look. And that same concept applies to other issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion. A number of companies have gotten requests that have garnered a lot of support to do diversity audits that are third party conducted or similar measures.
Let's just talk briefly about private companies. So obviously proxy season and this whole process is for publicly traded companies, but do private companies have anything to learn from this? What would you say to companies? I guess it's really a question for both. I mean, what's the takeaway for a company, whether you're public or private?
Yes, I think a lot of people can learn from what's going on in proxy season in general. So both private companies who may not have public investors, but also private market investors, think hedge funds, private equity firms, and other private investors. Sometimes there are a few that are publicly traded as well, and so maybe answering to shareholders through proxy season. But say that you aren't, while there's not the direct challenge of a shareholder resolution or a proxy vote, it can be a window to understand the expectations that you will still face on other fronts. And that's partly because it is just an illustration of the expectations that on ESG material issues that companies are facing. So I'm seeing through observe and analyze in ESG practices, what I have done through work with private companies, that they are as interested in and hearing as much indirectly through other investors, through their investors. Well, you're not going to see it at a proxy statement because it's the private markets. These sort of other financing measures are also interested in the same ESG topics. So if you're a business, you will have financing come to you, if not through shares in equity. You have bonds that you issue on the public market. You have financing that you will get from banks. And those banks are looking at the same types of ESG measures and often bringing it into their financing. So these types of climate and diversity issues are, I think, relevant across the spectrum. The supply chain issues, whether it be human rights or other issues, aren't just going to show up on an annual shareholder vote. They represent what are material issues that investors and other stakeholders are interested in. So I think it's relevant throughout.
And I was just going to jump in and again, just harp on this topic, right? Of the reason you said, of course, the other capital markets players, whether that's the banks or private equity firms or hedge funds, are often interested in these same ESG topics because they are material or can be material to that company or to that industry. What does that mean? It can affect the value of their investment. It can present risks to their investment. And so that's why, again, it's not a conspiracy, okay? It's a recognition that there are factors in the environmental, social, and governance topic categories that can affect the value of a company and can affect the value of an investment. And so, again, just to kind of drive it home this week, Erica, it occurs in both public and private markets because it can affect how much money you make, period.
Absolutely. And to highlight, put another line under the convergence that I mentioned earlier. One of the other pieces, here's some of the good news. If you're feeling a little besieged by what's going on right now and you think, it's all too much to handle. Some of the good news about this convergence is that there are more and more tools that can be applied to more and more types of investment styles and companies. So if you feel that what you see in the headlines, what you might see on a proxy statement, is hard to translate to your company operations or your investment style, it's not a one-size-fits-all game anymore. So there are ESG frameworks that have gotten more detailed, yes, so it can seem a little intimidating, but there is increasingly guidance to adapt these frameworks for small and medium enterprises, for asset classes beyond equity. And if you stop, take a deep breath, and ask the question of what can I apply to my situation, you will almost certainly find tools that you can use.
Beautiful note to end on, Erica. Thank you. And I'm taking a deeper breath just sitting here with you.
We can all take a deeper breath these days, right?
Thank you, Erica. All right. Well, I'd just like to thank you for spending the Friday before Memorial Day weekend here with me doing this podcast. Really appreciate it. And for folks that have questions, there's a blog post that Erica just wrote on the ClimeCo website, also kind of mirroring some of the stuff we talked about that just gives a really nice overview of proxy season as well. And as always, we love to hear about feedback about the podcast and any other topics that you'd like us to tackle. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and follow ESG Decoded and ClimeCo across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and the planet.